This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. This Top 10 won't be one where I'm looking at individual cards. Instead, this video is going to cover the 10 years in Magic's history that have had the most bannings and restrictions. 2019 is one of the worst years for bannings and restrictions in recent memory, and I was kind of curious how it would stack up against other years. In a lot of ways, this is a list of the 10 years where Magic's R&D screwed up the most by printing way too many powerful cards because drastic moves were necessary to preserve the health of the game in multiple formats. So, what counts as a ban or restriction for this list? Well, anytime a card is added to the banned and restricted list for a format for the very first time, it counts as an instance of a banning or restriction. This means that one single card can't account for more than one banning, because if a card gets the axe in both standard and modern, I count the card each time. I decided to do it this way instead of only counting a card a single time, because I think cards that require bans across multiple formats tend to be especially egregious mistakes, and I wanted that to be represented in this video. Also, this video only counts bannings and restrictions in formats that are currently played at the Pro Tour and Grand Prix level. In other words, Pauper, Brawl, and EDH are not formats I'm going to be talking about here. Alright, let's get started. At number 10, it's 2015, a year that required 9 bannings and restrictions. 2015 makes it onto this list in large part as a result of Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise. These two cards proved to be reasonable for Standard, where they were never banned, but the two cards required bannings in Modern and Legacy, and they also had to be restricted in Vintage. In non-rotating formats, which were loaded up with fetch lands and cheap cantrips, it proved to be far too easy to load up the graveyard and effectively turn Treasure Cruise into Ancestral Recall in the very early part of the game, so blue decks in those formats became way too good. These two cards weren't the only problems, though. 2015 was also the year that Birthing Pod had to be banned in Modern for enabling far too consistent of combo decks, and Chalice of the Void had to be restricted in Vintage because it was just way too good at disrupting basically every deck in the format. At number 9, it is 2006, which, like 2015, was a year that required 9 bannings and restrictions. It is the only year to make this list where all of its bannings and restrictions were made in a single format. That format, though, which was mirrored and block constructed, had become completely degenerate because affinity decks were completely insane. 8 of the 9 cards for that year had to be banned just to make it so that affinity was on a more equal power level with other decks in the format. This included the 6 artifact lands, which were way too good at helping you power out cards with affinity or other artifact synergies, and it also included Arcbound Ravager and Disciple of the Vault, both of which were incredibly powerful artifact synergies that worked incredibly well together. And in addition to those 8 cards, Aether Vial was also banned because it made all aggro decks way too good, between saving you huge amounts of mana and letting you put creatures into play at instant speed. At number 8, it is a very recent year, 2017, a year which required 12 bannings and restrictions. So 2019 isn't the only very recent example of a year which required a ton of fixing. This year is probably most remembered for 2 pretty busted Standard cards, Emrakul the Promised End and Smuggler's Copter. The Copter was far too efficient. It was effectively a 2-mana 3/3 with flying that looted for you every turn. It got so bad that almost everyone in the format was playing aggro decks just so they could play Smuggler's Copter. Emrakul was also way too easy to cast, especially with the help of something like Aetherworks Marvel, another Standard card that needed to be banned in 2017. It was just far too easy to compile the necessary energy to cheat something scary into play. All 3 of those cards seem like they were intentionally pushed by Wizards, but things got a little bit out of hand. But another card that had to be banned in Standard in 2017 is a lot less excusable, and that was Felidar Guardian. Somehow, they managed to overlook a turn 4 2-card combo that involved the Guardian and Saheeli Rai, who could allow you to make infinite copies of the Guardian. Really not sure how they overlooked that on 2 cards that are even in the same block, but there you go. Reflector Mage also had to get banned out of Standard because the format completely warped around it, to the point that there was no point in playing creatures who didn't do something when they entered the battlefield. In addition to all the busted things happening in Standard, this was also the year that Gitaxian Probe and Golgari Grave Troll had to get banned in Modern. The Probe made several decks way too good by being a free draw spell that gave you information, and the Troll had to be rebanned once Dredge became too good in the format. The Probe also got restricted in Vintage in 2017. Meanwhile, Sensei's Divining Top had to get banned in Legacy for slowing games down and being too good in decks like Counterbalance and Miracles, and Thorn of Amethyst and Monastery Mentor got restricted in Vintage. The Thorn had a similar effect on Vintage to what Chalice of the Void had done, which we mentioned earlier. It was basically too good at hating against almost all the decks in the format, and Monastery Mentor-based control decks were way too good in the format. At number 7, I have 2005, a year which required 12 bannings and restrictions. Earlier, we looked at 2006, a year where a bunch of cards had to be banned and Mirrodin block constructed to weaken Affinity, and, well, in 2005, those exact same bans go down in Standard, with the exception of Aether Vial, though the Vial would be banned and extended in 2005. In addition to those cards we've already discussed, Trinisphere was restricted in Vintage that year, basically because it hates on cheap spells, which is sort of the backbone of the Vintage format. Imperial Seal had to be banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage because it was a tutor effect, and those tend to be way too good in formats with lots of busted cards, especially in combo decks. Personal Tutor was restricted in Vintage for the same reason in 2005. At number 6, it is 2004, a year which required 17 bannings and restrictions. The most famous banning of the year was probably Skullclamp, a card that Wizards famously changed late in development, and when they did so, they accidentally made it absurdly strong since it basically amounted to being able to pay 1 mana to draw 2 cards if you had an X1 in play. It had to be banned in Mirrodin block, Standard, Extended, and Legacy because it was just too good. Metalworker was also banned and extended in Legacy in 2004 because the recent influx of powerful artifacts from Mirrodin, including the artifact lands, had made it capable of producing absurd amounts of mana. 2004 really makes this list, though, because a complete overhaul of Legacy went down that year. Up until 2004, the banned list for Legacy was kind of complicated. If a card had ever been banned or restricted in Standard and Vintage, respectively, it was also banned in Legacy. But in 2004, they realized a bunch of cards were banned in the format that just didn't need to be, but they also realized there was some stuff legal in Vintage that should definitely not be in Legacy, so they banned a ton of cards in Legacy that year. Some of the biggest bans in the format included Bazaar of Baghdad, which made graveyard decks way too good, and Mishra's Workshop, a land that could produce an absurd 3 mana all on its own. At number 5, it's 2003, a year which required 21 bannings and restrictions. By the way, if you're keeping score at home, every single year from 2003 to 2006 is on this list, a span of time which I think pretty easily is the worst 4-year span in the history of the banned and restricted list. However, in 2003's defense, no bannings were required in Standard at least. I guess that's something. One of the biggest issues of the year was the introduction of the busted Storm mechanic. A mechanic so powerful that the scale that Mark Rosewater uses to discuss how broken mechanics are is literally called the Storm Scale. Only one card with the actual mechanic was banned in 2003, Mind's Desire, which had to be banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage, but this was done a mere 6 days after it had become legal to play in those formats. This was actually the fastest ban in the history of the game. Basically, it was just way too easy in the formats with larger card pools to just go off with Storm. Cards like Gush and Frantic Research were free spells that drew you more cards, meaning you were adding to your Storm count while also digging into your library for the key cards that you needed. Gush had to be banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage, and Frantic Research had to be banned and extended. In addition to that, Burning Wish had to be restricted in Vintage and banned in Legacy because of Storm decks. You could use the Wish to eventually grab a card with Storm out of your sideboard at the exact right time and win the game with it. Lion's Eye Diamond created similar problems, as it could be used in conjunction with cards that let you cast cards in your graveyard to get 2 absurd Storm counts, because you also get 3 mana, and that's why it was restricted in Vintage and banned in Legacy. Other cards to get the axe that year include Entomb in Legacy, which made Reanimator decks too consistent, and Tinker in Extended, which made it way too easy to cheat huge artifacts into play. And at number 4, it's this year, 2019. When I went into this list, I was curious where it would fall, and now we have our answer. 2019 is the 4th worst year in the history of the game in terms of bannings and restrictions, which is not a good place to be. So, where to begin in this year loaded up with mistakes? I guess we'll start with one old card that had to get banned in Modern, Krark Clan Ironworks, because it enabled some silly combos there. That was an innocuous enough beginning to 2019, but the second half of the year, things really fell apart. Modern Horizons was released, and it had Hogak, Arisen Necropolis in it, a card that made dredge decks in Modern absolutely insane, and by far the best deck in the format. Both Hogak and Bridge from Below had to be banned this year because of that dominance. Also caught in the crossfire was Faithless Looting, a card which had enabled a ton of decks in Modern, but its power in Hogak decks was really the last straw. Alright, so 2019 saw Wizards really screw up Modern, keep that in mind, and let's see what other formats needed complete overhauls due to recent cards. Well, Vintage had to have Karn, the Great Creator, Mystic Forge, and Narset Parter of Veils restricted. Karn and Mystic Forge got the axe because they were too good with the powerful artifacts Vintage has, and Narset had to be banned because her static ability was excellent against way too much of the field. In addition to that, older cards like Mental Misstep and Golgari Grave Troll also got restricted there. So now we are up to both Modern and Vintage needing an overhaul due to new cards. While Legacy mostly escaped unscathed, at least compared to other formats, a Modern Horizons card, Wrenn and 6, had to be banned there because the format completely warped around it. People basically had to stop playing 1 toughness creatures. Turns out a 2-mana Planeswalker who was actually good is not such a good idea. Then, of course, Standard had to have 4 cards banned this year. Field of the Dead combo decks were too good, and then the printing of Throne of Eldraine really messed things up because it brought both Oko and Once Upon a Time to the table. Oko completely takes over games, and a free draw spell like Once Upon a Time made Oko decks too consistent. Veil of Summer was also banned because it made those same decks resilient to counter magic, which was extra unfair. Those 3 cards all made it so there was no reason not to be playing green, and Oko was showing up in more than 60% of decks. So, yeah, 2019 was bad. Recent cards had to be banned in Modern and Legacy and restricted in Vintage, and of course also in Standard. That's what makes 2019 the 4th worst year so far. The kind of good news, I guess, is that 2019 does lag pretty far behind the top 3 years on this list. At number 3, it is 1994, a year which required 39 bannings and restrictions. If you're keeping count, that is 14 more than 2019. However, 1994 is kind of a weird case. It was the very first year the ban and restricted list existed, and as a result, lots and lots of cards had to be added, including Black Lotus and the rest of the Power 9, and other busted cards like Soul Ring and Channel. The year is also pretty famous for having some kind of odd bannings and restrictions, ones that didn't last very long. This included cards like Dingus Egg and Sword of the Ages. So, while 1994 does have a higher number of bannings and restrictions than a year like 2019, it isn't a perfect reflection of how messed up the format was, because 1994 involved a lot of experimentation, with Wizards really trying to figure out how this ban and restricted list thing works. At number 2, it is 2011, a year which had 40 bannings and restrictions. The most famous bannings of 2011 are undoubtedly Jace the Mind Sculptor and Stoneforge Mystic, both cards which powered the dominant Caw-Blade deck in Standard, a deck built around insane card advantage and value, with Jace and the Mystic being the most egregious offenders on that front. Both were banned in Standard, Extended, and Modern. However, in some ways, 29 has an artificially inflated count, sort of like 1994 does, and that's because Modern was created that year, and it was immediately given its own rather extensive ban and restricted list. 29 of the 40 bannings and restrictions that year came in Modern. Bannings in Modern included lots of cards we've already talked about, like the Artifact Lands, Sensei's Top, and Skull Clamp. And at number 1, it's 1999, a year which required a whopping 69 bannings and restrictions. That's a number that makes 2019 look like the best year ever. 1999 was the year of the dreaded combo winter, a time when every single format was being dominated by insanely fast and consistent combo decks. That year, Wizards had to ban and restrict cards wholesale to make it so that there was a reason to do something other than play a combo deck in every single format. A big problem for the year was the introduction of Urza's Block, a set loaded up with stupid, powerful cards. So, what had to be banned in this environment? Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all 69 of these cards, but it is actually pretty easy to break down most of the bans and restrictions into categories. One of those was cards that allowed far too much mana too early, like Lotus Petal, Mishra's Workshop, Tolarian Academy, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, and Mox Diamond. Another category was cards that let you rip through your deck for combo pieces too easily, like Frantic Search, Time Spiral, Memory Jar, Windfall, and Yawgmoth's Bargain. Tutors were also axed across most formats. This included Mystic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, and Tinker. All of these cards were restricted or banned either because they made combo decks faster, in the case of the fast mana, or because they let you rip through your library to find your combo pieces, or because they were tutors that let you search up your combo pieces directly. Tons more cards were banned and restricted that year, but those are the broad strokes. If nothing else, we can be glad that Wizards hasn't had another year like 1999 in the 20 years since then. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future editions of MTG Top 10, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see the Top 10s I've already made, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.